The highway stretched endlessly beneath the dim moonlight, an infinite ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the barren landscape. Inside the car, Sarah, Ethan, Mia, and Jake sat in exhausted silence. Their weekend camping trip had been fun, but now all they wanted was to get home. Sarah, the driver, stifled a yawn and turned up the radio to break the oppressive quiet. Static hissed from the speakers, a frustrating reminder of how far they were from civilization. "Maybe try another station," Mia suggested from the back seat. Ethan leaned forward and started twisting the dial. At first, it was just more static. Then a faint voice broke through. "Hello, Sarah, Ethan, Mia, and Jake," it said, smooth and deliberate. "What the hell?" Jake sat up straight. "Did it just say our names?" Sarah's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Ethan turned the volume knob up. "It's got to be some prank, probably a recording." But the voice continued, ignoring their confusion. "You're traveling down Highway 26, aren't you? You need to turn back now. This road isn't safe for you." A chill ran through the car. "That's not funny," Mia said, her voice trembling. "How does it know who we are?" "Coincidence," Ethan insisted, though he sounded uncertain. "Maybe it's one of those creepy radio stories where they use random names." "No," Sarah whispered. "It said we're on Highway 26. The group fell silent. The radio hissed, the voice gone, replaced by an eerie melody that didn't belong on any normal station. "Turn it off," Mia said sharply. Ethan complied, but even with the radio off, the melody lingered faintly, as though it was seeping into the car from the outside. The group tried to shake off their unease, dismissing it as a strange coincidence. The highway stretched on, seemingly endless, until Sarah spotted headlights approaching in the opposite lane. "Finally another car," Jake muttered, relief flooding his voice. But as the vehicle drew closer, something felt off. The lights were too bright and the car didn't seem to be slowing. "It's coming too fast," Sarah said, pulling over to the shoulder. The oncoming car should have passed them, but instead it vanished, its horn blaring in the air as if it had been swallowed by the night. "Did you see that?" Mia gasped. "I saw it," Jake said, his voice shaking. "It just disappeared." Before anyone could respond, the radio clicked back on by itself. The voice returned, colder this time. "You didn't listen. Turn back now, or suffer the consequences." Sarah's hands trembled on the wheel. "What do we do?" "We keep going," Ethan said, though his bravado had waned. "Whatever this is, it's just someone messing with us." The car continued down the road, but the tension inside grew unbearable. The headlights no longer illuminated the landscape. They were swallowed by an unnatural darkness. Then the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," Sarah muttered, trying to restart it, but the key wouldn't turn. Outside, the air grew heavy, and faint shadows began shifting at the edges of their vision. They seemed to move with purpose, closing in on the car. "What are those?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan leaned toward the window. "Probably just trees." A face appeared suddenly, inches from the glass. It was pale, its eyes hollow and lifeless. A ghastly grin stretched unnaturally across its face. Mia screamed. Sarah frantically tried the ignition again, and the engine roared to life. Without hesitation, she floored the gas pedal. The car shot forward, leaving the shadows behind. For a moment, relief filled the car. Then the voice returned, louder than ever, blaring through the speakers. "You can't escape. You belong to us now." The road ahead twisted and warped, the asphalt rippling like water. The headlights revealed nothing but an endless void, and the car began to slow, no matter how hard Sarah pressed the gas. "Why is this happening?" Mia cried. Ethan reached for his phone. "I'll call for help." But there was no signal. The screen flickered, displaying the same chilling message: "Turn back." The car ground to a halt, and the shadows closed in. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and stepped out, desperate to see where they were. What she saw chilled her to the core. The road was gone, replaced by a field of blackened earth littered with old, rusted vehicles. and in the distance, figures stood motionless, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The radio clicked on one last time. "Welcome home," the voice said. The figures began to move, their smiles widening as they approached the car. Sarah scrambled back inside, locking the doors. "What do we do?" Jake yelled. Before anyone could answer, the figures surrounded the car, their hands slamming against the windows. The glass cracked, then shattered. The last thing any of them heard was the sound of laughter, deep, guttural, and inhuman. By morning, the highway was quiet again. Another driver passed by and noticed a car abandoned on the shoulder, its doors open, the engine cold. The radio played faintly, repeating the same chilling words, "Turn back now." After hours of driving through endless stretches of empty road, Jessica felt the weight of fatigue settling in. The monotony of the highway had begun to gnaw at her sanity, and the night seemed endless. The glow of headlights on the road was the only thing keeping her going, until finally, she saw it. A small, unmarked motel, tucked away off the road like a secret forgotten by time. The neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly, offering a much-needed respite. She hesitated, her grip tightening on the wheel, but the weariness in her bones urged her to pull in. The gravel crunched under her tires as she parked, and the dimly lit parking lot seemed almost too quiet. No crickets, no distant hum of other vehicles. Just silence. Still, she convinced herself it was just a small, isolated spot, and the last place she had to rest before reaching her destination. The motel's building was an odd mix of old-world charm and decay. The faded curtains fluttered in the windows, and the paint on the walls was chipped, but the place had a strange appeal, rustic yet inviting. Jessica made her way to the lobby, noticing there were no other cars in the lot and no other guests around. The lobby, despite its emptiness, was well kept. Behind the counter stood a man, thin and pale, with an odd, unnerving smile plastered across his face. His eyes, though, seemed distant, empty. He greeted her with an overly cheerful tone. "Welcome to the Phantom Motel. How can I help you tonight?" His voice echoed too loudly in the silence, making her uneasy. I need a room for the night," she stammered, still unsure of why she felt a cold shiver down her spine. "Of course. Room 6 is available," the clerk said, his smile widening unnaturally. "It's a special room for special guests." He handed her a key with a numbered tag, the metal cold against her palm. Jessica hesitated but said nothing. Her body was screaming for rest, and the thought of a warm bed was more appealing than any lingering doubt. Room 6 was clean but devoid of warmth. The walls were painted an odd shade of gray, the bed perfectly made, the curtains drawn tight. A flickering lamp beside the bed cast long shadows against the walls. Everything about it felt slightly off, like a picture that was almost perfect but not quite right. She lay down on the bed, her mind still restless, but the exhaustion from the long drive soon overtook her. The sound of her own breathing was the only noise in the room until, unexpectedly, she was jolted awake in the middle of the night by faint whispers. At first, she couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to come from behind the walls, a soft murmur, as if someone was speaking in the room next door. Startled, she sat up in bed, trying to focus on the shadows creeping along the walls. The whispers grew louder, clearer, words she could almost recognize but couldn't quite grasp. "Get out. Leave now. He's watching." Jessica got out of bed, her heart pounding. She opened the door slowly, glancing down the dark hallway, but it was empty. Her footsteps echoed as she walked, her instincts urging her to go back to her room. But something kept pulling her forward. She turned a corner and nearly ran into a man standing motionless in front of her. He was wearing a rumpled suit, his face gaunt, eyes wide and bloodshot. "Please, you have to leave," he whispered, his voice strained. "They're not who they say they are. No one here is real." His hands shook as he clutched a coffee cup, the steam rising from it in thin tendrils. The man stepped closer, his breath reeking of sour coffee. "The clerk, he's one of them. They take people like you. It's already too late." Before she could respond, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the motel. Jessica stood there, heart hammering, her breath quickening. Her mind raced to make sense of the encounter, but all she could feel was the weight of her own growing unease. She rushed back to her room, locked the door behind her, and pulled the covers tightly around herself. But sleep was impossible. The whispers had returned, now louder, like an army of voices, chanting over and over again, "They're coming for you." There's no escape. In the morning, Jessica was ready to leave. She threw on her clothes and hurried outside, only to find her car was gone. The parking lot was empty, not a single vehicle in sight. Panic surged through her. She turned in circles, looking for any sign of the car, but it had vanished. The only person in the lot was the motel clerk, standing by the door, smiling at her with that unnerving, empty grin. "Where's my car?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The clerk didn't move, his eyes cold and vacant. "Your car is no longer needed. You won't be going anywhere." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? I have to leave." "You can't leave," the clerk said softly, his voice taking on a chilling finality. "You're one of us now. Welcome to the Phantom Motel." In desperation, Jessica turned to flee. She ran toward the highway, hoping to reach the road and flag down a passing car. But no matter how far she ran, she found herself back at the motel's entrance. It was as though the road had looped in on itself. The same empty gravel lot stretched out before her, the same cold air pressing down on her skin. The man from the hallway appeared again, his face ashen and haunted. "You're stuck here just like the rest of us," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "There's no leaving the Phantom Motel. No one ever leaves." The whispers began to rise, growing louder, more insistent. The walls of the motel seemed to move, shifting, closing in on her. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, shapes too dark to fully make out. And as night fell again, Jessica realized the true horror of the place. The Phantom Motel wasn't just a trap. It was a prison, a place that claimed the souls of those who passed through, trapping them in an endless cycle of terror and torment. And there, in the dark, she was just another lost guest, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to take her place. David's road trip had been uneventful until he hit the tunnel. The GPS showed it as a shortcut through the mountains, shaving an hour off his drive home. It was late at night, and the surrounding woods were cloaked in an oppressive darkness, broken only by the faint glow of his car's headlights. The entrance to the tunnel loomed ahead, its mouth wide and yawning like some ancient beast. A flickering overhead light cast intermittent shadows on the damp concrete walls. A sign by the roadside read, "Tunnel of Echoes. Proceed with caution." David smirked, dismissing it as an overdramatic warning for drivers. As he entered, his tires hummed against the asphalt, and his headlights illuminated the graffiti-scrawled walls. The darkness swallowed his car as he progressed, the tunnel stretching longer than he had expected. A faint sound broke the monotony, a low murmur that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the tunnel. David glanced at his radio, wondering if he had accidentally turned it on, but it was off. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't static. It was whispering. "David!" He froze, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The whispers were faint but unmistakable, calling his name over and over again. He laughed nervously. "Must be the wind," he muttered, trying to reassure himself. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. "David, turn back! Leave!" His foot pressed harder on the accelerator, but the tunnel seemed endless. The GPS was glitching, showing his car as stationary despite the speedometer climbing. He glanced in the rearview mirror only to see the faint glow of headlights behind him. Headlights that hadn't been there before. The car approaching from behind seemed to glide rather than drive, its lights too bright and its silhouette too distorted. He blinked, and the car was gone, leaving only darkness in its wake. Panic set in as the whispers morphed into screams, echoing off the walls with a deafening intensity. They weren't random. They were pleading, warning, weeping, and they all knew his name. "David, you can't escape." He slammed the accelerator to the floor, the engine roaring in protest. The tunnel lights above flickered erratically, casting surreal shadows that seemed to move on their own. The walls seemed closer now, pressing in on him as though the tunnel itself was alive. Up ahead he saw a faint light, a glimmer of hope at the end of the tunnel. Relief washed over him as he sped toward it, but the light flickered and vanished, plunging him back into darkness. His car abruptly stalled, the engine sputtering before dying completely. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by his ragged breathing. David fumbled with his keys, desperate to restart the car, but his fingers trembled too much to grip them properly. The whispers returned, now clearer than ever, coming from all around him. "David, why didn't you listen?" He turned, his flashlight app trembling in his hand as he shone it into the back seat. Empty. But the air was thick with a presence, a weight pressing down on him. A figure emerged from the darkness ahead, barely illuminated by the dying light of his flashlight. Its face was indistinct, as though the shadows clung to it like a mask. But its eyes glowed faintly, pinpricks of light in the void. "Who are you?" David shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and inhuman. The whispers around him crescendoed into screams, and the figure's mouth opened wide, revealing an abyss of writhing shadows. "David, join us!" he screamed, scrambling out of the car and running down the tunnel, his footsteps echoing in the void. But no matter how far he ran, the end never came. The tunnel stretched infinitely, the walls seeming to shift and warp around him. Exhausted, he collapsed, his breaths ragged. The whispers softened, almost comforting now. The figure appeared again, this time behind him, its cold breath against his neck. "David, there's no way out." The next morning, a state trooper patrolling the highway found David's car abandoned at the entrance to the Tunnel of Echoes. The engine was cold, and the keys were still in the ignition. Inside the tunnel, the trooper heard faint whispers echoing from the walls. One voice stood out, trembling and desperate, calling a name over and over. "Help me. Please. I'm still here."